Okay, let's unpack this. You look around the world right now, and it feels less like a single system, doesn't it? More like several big forces pulling different ways. We're seeing powers like India, China, Brazil really stepping up. It feels like a fundamentally multipolar moment.
It truly is. And in that, shifting landscape, we're diving into the relevance of an institution that's been, well, a cornerstone for decades.
Leap to seven.
Industrialized democracy.
Right.
Exactly.
And we've got this specific analytical report here giving us a snapshot, really, of where the G7 stands heading into 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from this material, its history, its current role, the big challenges it's facing, and maybe what its future could look like.
Yeah, and the core question, the one the report keeps coming back to, and what we're exploring with you today, is basically, is the G7 still a vital, effective forum in this fragmented world?
Or is it maybe becoming less relevant?
Is its influence fading? That's the crux of it?
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, just like the report does.
Yeah.
What exactly is the G7? How did it first come about?
So the G7, it's an informal group. You've got Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US.
The big Western economies, essentially.
Pretty much. And it's sort of solidified into this bloc back in the 1970s.
The 70s, wow, a very different world then.
Yeah.
What was happening that made them think, okay, we need to form this group?
Well, the report points to it being largely a reaction to major global economic shocks happening at the time. Think the oil crisis, things like that.
Oh, okay. Big disruptions.
Right. These were the dominant industrial economies, and they felt they needed a way to coordinate policy, maybe more nimbly than in bigger, slower forums.
So coordination was the name of the game. What were their main goals initially, according to the report?
Primarily coordinating macroeconomic policy. That was central. But also promoting open markets and, importantly, reinforcing those shared democratic values among the leading Western industrial powers.
Okay, and this is where the report stresses we need to be clear about the difference between the G7 and the G20.
Absolutely critical distinction. The G7 is specifically these 7 sort of like-minded Western democracies, similar political systems, deep historical ties.
Right.
The G20, that came later, it's much broader. It brings in major emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, others. So much wider representation.
But maybe less automatic agreement.
Exactly. Less inherent strategic alignment than you'd find in the G7.
Okay, so born from economic crises in the 70s, a club of wealthy democracies. Fast forward to 2025, the world looks really different, which brings us right to the core challenge the report identifies for the G7 today.
That's precisely it. The #1 challenge, according to the report, is this huge shift towards multipolarity we mentioned. Global power, economic, political, it's just, well, much more spread out now than when the G7 started.
And the report links other things to this challenge too, right? Like ongoing economic bumps, geopolitical crises popping up everywhere.
Yeah, and even the speed of tech change, like AI.
So how do those things specifically challenge the G7's traditional role, according to the report?
Well, the report suggests they basically amplify the G7's representational gap. If you have crises or technologies needing global solutions, a group representing less than 10% of the world's population and, a shrinking slice of the global economy finds it harder to just decide things for everyone or set global rules effectively.
Yeah, I can see that.
It creates this tension the report highlights. Is the G7 now lacking legitimacy, lacking utility?
Or is it still vital? And to get into that, let's look at the specifics the source gives us about the actual 2025 summit. What does the report tell us?
Okay, so the report nails down the dates. June 15th to 17th, 2025.
And it's in Kananaskis, Alberta, Canada. The source points out that's where the G8 met in 2002, back when Russia was still in the group. That feels significant somehow.
It does, doesn't it? A nod to how much has changed.
Yeah.
The host is Canadian PM Justin Trudeau, and the theme is very telling. Building resilience in a fragmented world.
Right there in the theme. Addressing the challenges head on.
Directly.
And the agenda seems to reflect that complexity. The report lists a huge range of topics they plan to tackle. What jumps out from that list?
It really shows the sheer breadth of issues the G7 feels it needs to weigh in on. Geopolitics is still huge, obviously. Continued support for Ukraine.
Still top of mind.
Absolutely. And also diplomacy around the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Very heavy, complex global security issues.
Definitely. Then on the economy, they'll be talking about responses to what the report labels non-market practices.
Things like state subsidies, maybe, or pressuring companies for tech.
Yeah, stuff that distorts fair competition, also digital trade, managing fiscal imbalances, the usual economic coordination piece, but with new twists.
And technology, you mentioned AI earlier. That's got to be on there.
Oh, for sure. The report highlights tech and AI governance as a major focus. They're looking at potentially setting up cross-border AI standards, ethical guidelines.
Energy and climate always big for this group.
Still central. The report mentions the shift away from fossil fuels, securing supply chains for critical minerals, the stuff needed for green tech, and maybe even carbon border tariffs.
And engaging with the global south, given this multipolar world, feels crucial.
It is, and the report confirms it's on the agenda. Things like addressing debt, food insecurity, development gaps, trying to bridge some of those divides.
And finally, the report mentions institutional resilience. What's that about?
The report frames it as basically shoring up the G7's own ability to operate in this tough environment. So countering disinformation,
Oh, okay.
beefing up cybersecurity, protecting critical digital infrastructure. It's a really packed agenda.
Wow, that is an incredibly broad list for just 3 days.
Okay.
Does the report offer any clues about how they plan to actually make progress on all that? Or does it maybe hint at the difficulty?
Well, the report doesn't explicitly say this is too much, but it does stress the need for actionable outcomes, not just, fancy declarations.
Right, talk is cheap.
Exactly. It implies that because the scope is so vast, they have to be really strategic, focus on areas where the G7 members actually have a unique ability to lead or coordinate. So it acknowledges the difficulty, but also frames it as necessary if the G7 wants to stay in the game.
Stretching itself then. And stretching the guest list too. The report flags a big shift for 2025. The invited countries. This seems like a direct nod to that representation problem, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This is where you really see the G7 acknowledging, maybe implicitly, that it can't go it alone in this fragmented world. Canada's invited several key nations beyond the core seven.
And who's on the list? It's quite revealing.
It is India, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, Australia, South Africa, and Ukraine.
That's significant. Major players from different regions, big economies.
Exactly. The report really emphasizes their inclusion as a crucial step. The thinking is, the G7 alone can't effectively govern or even really influence things globally anymore. They need broader buy-in.
The report even pulls a specific quote about India's inclusion from Mark Carney.
Yeah, former head of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. He says, India's participation makes sense. It's the fifth largest economy and key to global stability.
Underscores the strategic thinking there. Bring in the heavy hitters.
Precisely. It's a calculated move.
So, okay, despite these representation challenges and needing to invite others, the report still argues the G7 has enduring strength. What's the case for this group still being vital?
Well, one big strength the report points to is strategic alignment. Because these are all liberal democracies, similar values, similar systems. There's a baseline agreement on the rules-based order, democratic governance.
Shared worldview, basically.
Yeah. And importantly, countering authoritarian economic pressure, the report specifically mentions China and Russia here. This shared outlook lets them potentially move faster and more cohesively than bigger, more diverse groups.
And that cohesion allows for coordination, especially in a crisis. The source highlights this with examples, right?
It does. The report gives specific examples from recent years. It points to the G7 coordinating big parts of the economic recovery during COVID between 2020 and 2022.
And their response to the war in Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely central in organizing sanctions, coordinating huge financial aid packages for Ukraine from 2022 onwards.
Okay.
And the report also notes their discussions back in 2023 about AI, a potential moratorium, which sort of paved the way for later things like the EU's AI Act and the G7's own AI code. So it suggests they can be a useful, agile first responder forum for emerging global issues.
And there's one more strength mentioned, soft power signaling.
Right. This is where the G7 can sometimes act faster than, say, the UN or even the G20. They can send collective signals about shared values, press freedom, LGBTQ plus rights, climate ambition.
So even if it's not legally binding.
Exactly. It sets norms, exerts influence, shapes the conversation globally. It's a form of power.
Okay, so that's the argument for the G7 still having clout. But the report is also pretty blunt about its limitations. What are the main criticisms?
The number one critique the report makes clear is just its fundamental lack of representation in today's world. The stats it quotes are pretty stark.
Okay, give us the numbers.
The report estimates the G7's share of global GDP in 2025 will be around 42%. Now, that sounds like a lot, but compare it to roughly 70% back in 1980.
Wow. That's a huge drop in relative economic weight.
Huge. And their share of global population, tiny, less than 10%. And this core group obviously excludes giants like China, but also, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, countries crucial to solving global problems now.
So the criticism is it's a club that just doesn't mirror the world's economic or demographic reality anymore.
Pretty much. And the report links this to another critique. Its Western-centric legacy. It's often seen, rightly or wrongly, as a rich nations club.
Focus on their own problems.
Potentially, yes. Prioritizing issues important to developed Western economies, maybe sometimes at the expense of, say, equitable global development.
And even when they do agree on something, how much power do they actually have to enforce it?
That's another key limitation the report highlights. G7 declarations. They're non-binding. There's no formal enforcement mechanism.
So it's all voluntary.
It relies on political will. Implementation can vary a lot between member countries, and it all depends on who's in power at the time, which can change, obviously.
This brings us to placing the G7 in the bigger picture, alongside other global groups. The report uses a comparison, which seems helpful.
Yeah, it provides a useful framework. It compares the G7, G20, BRICS plus A, and the UN based on trade-offs like speed, representation, and potential legal power.
Right, so the G7, as we've said, is rated high speed, low representation, medium legal power. Its strength is speed and cohesion, basically.
Exactly. Then you have the G20. The report puts it at medium speed, high representation, also medium legal power. It's got the economic weight, the inclusivity.
But it's slower, more fragmented, potentially.
That's the trade-off. More voices, harder consensus.
What about the BRICS Plus group? How does the report see them?
The report rates BRICS Plus currently as medium speed, medium representation, though that's growing with the Plus members, and low legal power. It's seen as a significant force challenging Western norms.
But maybe not fully coherent yet.
Right. Still dealing with internal differences, still building formal governance structures.
And the UN, the big one.
The UN is high representation, obviously, and high potential legal power through the Security Council. But as we all know, it's characterized by low speed, often gets bogged down by process and vetoes.
So putting all that comparison together, what's the report's conclusion about where the G7 fits in 2025?
The report argues it still leads in its specific niche, building consensus and coordinating action among liberal democracies on issues where they have strong shared interests.
Its core constituency, basically.
Exactly, but its overall influence, undeniably shared more than ever. It's a significant player, yes, but it can't really set the global agenda by itself anymore.
That analysis of where it fits is really clear. So, given all this, the strengths, the weaknesses, the comparisons, what does the report suggest about the future? What are the possible paths forward for the G7?
The report sketches out a few potential scenarios. One is what it calls a modernized G7 plus.
G7 plus, what does that mean?
It means formally integrating key partners, think India, South Korea, Australia on a more regular basis, not just as occasional guests. The report suggests this could really boost the G7's legitimacy and effectiveness.
Makes sense. Broaden the base of like-minded democracies. What's another path?
Another idea floated is G7, G20 integration, maybe merging agendas more closely or forming some kind of core group that bridges the two, aiming for better coordination between the G7 and the wider G20.
What if they just keep doing what they're doing now?
The report calls that the G7 status quo scenario. Basically, focus inward, maintain cohesion among the core seven, concentrate on areas like tech governance where they still hold sway.
But the risk there is...
The report warns that path likely leads to diminishing relevance outside that Western bloc. It becomes more niche.
And the final scenario is kind of the opposite.
Yeah, the report raises the possibility of the rise of BRICS Plus, where you see parallel governance norms, maybe parallel institutions, emerging largely from the global south.
Leading to a more fragmented world order.
Potentially, yes, a world where different blocs operate with different rules, which could further marginalize the G7.
Okay, so let's bring it all back to that central question we started with. Is the G7 still relevant in 2025? What's the bottom line from this report?
The report's conclusion is nuanced but pretty clear. Yes, the G7 is still relevant in 2025, but...
There's a but.
There's a but. Its relevance is increasingly conditional and specific.
Conditional relevance, what does it depend on?
It remains a vital platform for coordination among advanced democracies on specific issues where they align strongly and can act together, like Ukraine support, AI governance approaches, economic stability within their group, securing critical minerals.
So, still potent, but maybe in a narrower lane than before.
Exactly, less universally influential. However, the report really stresses that its overall influence is being tested by demographic shifts, economic realignments, and what it calls institutional fatigue, a general strain on these established global bodies.
It's just harder for this one group to steer the ship.
Much harder.
So, to stay relevant in this tough environment, what does the report say the G7 absolutely needs to do?
It boils down to three key things, according to the report. First, move beyond just inviting guests and engage emerging powers more permanently, more institutionally.
Really integrate them somehow.
Yes. Second, focus relentlessly on driving actionable outcomes. Turn the summit declarations into real results on the ground.
Walk the talk.
Exactly. And third, actively reinvent itself. Recognize that traditional economic power isn't the only game anymore. Soft power, inclusive diplomacy, genuine collaboration with a wider range of countries, that's crucial now.
That sounds like a necessary evolution, but maybe a really difficult one for a group founded in such a different time.
It definitely puts the scale of the challenge into perspective.
So here's a thought for you, the listener, to chew on, based on everything we've unpacked from this report. Looking at these possible futures, these challenges, can this group of 7 truly adapt? Can it become that more inclusive, action-focused forum that collaborates effectively with rising powers? Or will the sheer force of multipolarity and this institutional fatigue ultimately prove too much, leading to the G7 playing a much smaller role on the world stage?